Okay, so these questions are, I mean, taken from the video directly. So I'll just read it out and tell you the study. So the person is trying to understand the graphs that have been presented in your presentation, Umesh. So this is one of the graphs that is from Fontaine and Martin 2006, and she's trying, or I mean, they're trying to ask if why breeding density in 3 cases out of 4 is negative for resident birds.
Yes, the Fontaine and Martin slide. That's there over here on the screen. I think you can see the Fontaine and Martin American naturalists at the bottom there.
Yes, so this is, I think she's talking about this this graph C.
Yes.
Yeah.
The graph C, so this is all the predation rates relative to the control, or the breeding density relative to the control. So the control is where these nest predators are present, and so that's the baseline is 0. So what is the breeding density when these nest predators are present, and what is the breeding density when the nest predators are absent? So in C, like you can see, there are 3 species where the breeding density is actually lower when the predators are removed than when predators are present. Now, overall, this study shows that bird communities can be influenced by predation, and bird communities can respond to predation by deciding whether to nest in particular places, by deciding whether to breed in particular places, and by also deciding whether to sing and how loudly to sing and how often to sing. But in this case, there are, it looks like 3 species that are residents where the densities are actually lower in the absence of predators. But if you look at the size of the error bars around those, well, unfortunately, the error bar is also in black, and the bar itself is also in black. So if you look at those error bars, they're actually overlapping 0, which means actually there's no evidence for an effect. And so for these 3 species that are slightly below 0, actually, statistically, there's no evidence that the densities are actually lower.
So this is it. Yeah. So the next question is from Gustafsson 1987 paper. She's asking, why is the fitness more in 1983 than 1982 for both the presence and absence of tits?
Right. So this paper is the competition paper.
Yeah, this one.
This exploitation competition paper, which is basically excluding these 2 species of tits from nest boxes and looking at the. Can you hear me? There are lots of messages in the chat saying that my voice is not clear.
It is slightly unstable. Can you keep the mic closer to your mouth, probably?
Is this better?
Yeah, this is better, I think. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So you can see that the patterns in both these years are identical. So the qualitative patterns between 1982 and 1983 are identical. The reason why there is a slight variation, and why 1983 has slightly higher fitness than 1982 could be because 1983 in general was a better year for resources, and so there were more resources available than in the year 1982. So there is this year-to-year variability in the availability of resources also. It's not as if every year the number of eggs produced by a breeding pair would remain the same, that the number of nestlings offspring produced by a breeding pair of birds is going to remain the same. So there is this year-to-year minor variation in fitness or offspring production. And so 1983 happened to be a slightly better year than 1982, and that's well within normal variability in reproductive success. But the take-home message from this graph is basically that when you exclude these competitors that are exploitatively competing for the same resource, you do actually see an increase in the fitness of the collared flycatcher.
All right. So the next question is from the Hoey and Winkler 1994 paper about the dome and the cup, open cup nest study. So the person is asking, warbler with the dome and open cup nest, was the study done with changing the number of dome nests, keeping open nests the same?
So the number of dome nests remains the same. The number of open cup nests changes. So the dome cup is in white bars. Hang on a minute, I'm sorry, it looks like there's some echo here. I'll just go to look at the settings over here. Is this better? Is there less echo this way?
Not exactly, but
What about this?
can you say something again?
Is there less echo this way?
Yeah. This is better. Less of echoes.
Okay, sorry about that. There's some problem with the settings over here on my end. So if you look at the dome cup nests are represented by the open bars, and the open cup nests are by the gray bars. The number of the dome cup nests and the open cup nests is represented at the bottom of each of these sets of bars. So to the left of the hyphen is the number of dome nests, sorry, and to the right of the hyphen is the number of open cup nests. So the number of dome cup nests is the same in all these treatments, and the number of open cup nests is increased from 0 to 6 to 12 to 18. And what this is showing here is that even though the number of domed nests remains constant, if you increase the number of open cup nests artificially, the rates of predation on the domed nests go up. So the fact that there are higher numbers of open cup nests means that the level of predation on domed nests will also go up, even though the number of dome nests remains the same. And that is because the higher number of open cup nests might attract predators to the habitat, and the same predator that also feeds on the, also predates on the dome nest. So if you increase the number of open cup nests, the predator of both the domed nest and the open cup nest also increases in either their abundance or their activity, and therefore the predation on the dome nest also increases, even though the number of dome nests remains the same.
All right. So the next question is about mixed flock and how the foraging rate increases. So the person is asking, are they using or are they availing the same food source, like the prey? Are they availing the same source of food?
Let me just move to that slide. Is it this one?
So yeah, I mean, so basically they're asking if the food source is the same in the mixed flock situation.
Before I answer that, Manjari has a follow-up question on apparent competition, which is was the fitness of the predators, which was the snake, increased with the increase in the number of open cup nests. Was that studied? No, Manjari, that was not studied in this case. So we don't know whether the fitness of the common enemy, which is the glass snake, that mediates that apparent competition also increased in this case. Coming to the question about food resources among species in mixed species bird flocks, it's not as if all the species in a mixed species bird flock are eating the same kind of food. They're all insectivorous birds, or basically eating arthropods, including things like spiders. There are a lot of species in mixed species bird flocks that actually feed on insects or spiders that are in the vegetation or in the foliage. So these are insects that are sitting on leaves or sitting on twigs or sitting on the trunks of trees. There are other species in mixed blocks that are not feeding on these kinds of arthropods. They're feeding on insects in flight. So birds like drongos, birds like flycatchers, they're part of the flock, but they're eating insects that are in flight. So there is some partitioning of resources. There is some difference in the kinds of resources that species in mixed flocks are eating. I have a follow-up question from Sriram. What is the on the parent competition study? What is the significance of the study of more open cup nests? Since the number of open versus closed is not really controllable, does this factor help in conservation, or is it just to study the behavior? So, Sriram, actually, in this case, the number of open versus closed nests was controlled by the researchers. So they actually added open cup nests, right? So this was to study behavior, this was to study apparent competition, this was to study how a common enemy of two species mediates their impacts on each other. How does the abundance of, how does the increase in the abundance of species A result in a change in the abundance of species B, while A and B both share the same predator, in this case the snake. So it was just to study behavior. However, nest augmentation, adding nest boxes and so on is a very common form of conservation intervention, especially where species are threatened and you want to increase their densities. People putting out nest boxes is a very, very common conservation intervention. Manjari has a follow-up on the sentinel species and habitat use study, which is on the screen right now. Is in the sentinel species and habitat use, could you please further elaborate what is indicated by the red region and the blue region? Certainly. You have two cases, Manjari. You have a case on the left where the sentinel species has not been removed. So that's a control situation. You have a case on the right where the sentinel species, which is this ant shrike, which is the center of the flock, which is the most central important species in the flock, has been removed. Red is showing you areas, look at the right side first. Red is showing you areas where the mixed flock foraged in the presence of the sentinel species. So you're looking at the habitat from the top, you're looking at it at a map from the top, and you're seeing that red is the area where the flock foraged in the presence of the sentinel species. Blue is the area where the flock foraged in the absence of the sentinel species. So once the sentinel species has been removed and left aside for 3 days, so you remove the sentinel species, keep it aside for 3 days in a cage, and then they release it back. But in those 3 days, where is this flock foraging? On the left side, what you're seeing is a flock that has not been manipulated. So basically, you're seeing on the right side, you're seeing 3 days. You remove the sentinel species and see what is happening. On the right side, you're monitoring the flock in the same way, but you're saying you're keeping the sentinel species. So in those 3 days, when the sentinel species is actually still there, which is the control, what is the area where the flock is foraging? And you can see there's a huge overlap between the blue areas and the red areas, right? So basically, that's a control. So in this experimental setup, what is happening is that they have a control where they don't remove the sentinel species, and the flock continues to forage in the same locations day after day. Whereas if you remove the sentinel species on the right side, the flock changes the location, it changes the kind of forest that it's foraging in, tending to forage more in dense forests to avoid predators.
Okay, I think the next question is for Mousumi.
Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah. So again, this is from the video directly.
I have one last question here, Jotin, from Niharika. Which Niharika asks if there are any fixed or identified bird assemblages. If yes, where can we get them? Generally, Niharika, an assemblage the definition of assemblage is the set of species of a particular taxonomic group that is found in a particular place at a particular time. Now, at any location, you are going to see changes in the habitat. Those changes in the habitat could be natural or it could be man-made. But, you know, so bird assemblages are changing over time, and it would be very rare to find an assemblage of species where, you know, the abundances of the species in the assemblages are not changing, or not fluctuating, and so on. So it's unlikely that there are any fixed bird assemblages, in that you only have these species and there'll be no other species, and you only have these species at these population densities. But by and large, we can say that there is a rainforest bird assemblage, you know, that consists of species like, you know, like the great hornbill and so on, and the great erratic-tailed bronco, and a number of other species. You can say there's a desert or a scrub, dry, arid land bird assemblage, which has the great Indian bustard and a number of larks and so on. But so by and large, what you can do is you can say that there are sets of species that are unique to certain habitats. So that's to the extent to which we
Right.
Thank you very much, Jubin. I'll stop presenting now.
All right. Okay. So for the, I mean, this is from the discussion forum. I think Mousumi couldn't answer this question. So basically, the question is about the paper that Mousumi was presenting in for population survival. I think Umesh's paper itself.
Yeah, I saw the questions and I was wondering if Umesh would want to answer those questions.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just spell out the question first. I'll just,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So the
Moshimi, could you share the screen?
Presentation? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. 1 second. Just give me a second. I'm having some trouble. So sorry. I'm not being able to share it for some reason.
Ma'am, just a minute, ma'am. I will just check.
Okay. Do I have to disconnect?
Oh, you have to be made co-host. Are you co-host?
That's fine.
So there's the arrow button at the bottom.
Ma'am, you are having a Windows or Mac, ma'am?
I'm having a Mac.
Okay. Just check in the settings, ma'am. Privacy pay, you need to give some access.
Okay.
Yeah, just check once whether that is given access for the Gmail.
Okay.
But Moshimi, if you could tell me which paper this is, I can pull up the graph here.
Yeah. So this is a paper, demographic superiority with increased logging.
I see.
Yeah. I'll tell you the figure number.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
So there are two questions. One is with reference to figure 1, and
Yes.
the other is with figure 2. Yeah. So Jobin, can you tell us the question? Yeah.
Jobin?
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry. So, so the person is asking the question with the difference between the logged and the unlogged forest, and she is asking why the birds Or at this point, why are we not considering emigrating individuals, and don't the birds emigrate during this period? And she's wanting to have a little more explanation about that.
I think she's,
Explanation.
yeah, she's referring, sorry, I think she's referring to the post-breeding to breeding interval. In figure 1, no, it says probability of surviving. Phi is probability of surviving and not emigrating.
Correct. So phi, which is apparent survival, is the probability that a particular individual bird survives and stays in the same location from 1 year to the next. So when we go out and we estimate survival rates in birds, we can't really tell whether a bird has died or whether it has permanently moved away from that patch. So if you catch a bird in one at a particular point in time, and then you don't catch it after that, and you don't basically recapture it after that, you don't know whether it's died, and you don't know whether it's completely moved away to some other location where you are not studying the population. So you cannot separate what is called mortality, death, and permanent emigration, that is bird moving away permanently. So typically we estimate apparent survival, which is the probability the bird survives and stays on the same site. And this is what this graph is showing, that which is that as tree density increases, that is logging intensity reduces. So the higher the density of trees, the lower the intensity of logging, the greater the survival from 1 year to the other.
Okay, so related to the same, very similar to the last question is this question where she's asking, during breeding season, the birds preferred selectively logged forest, while post-breeding season, they preferred thicker forest or denser forest. So she's asking for a reason behind this preference.
Anand, it's actually not hands-free. I don't. Should I just use the computer audio, you mean? So is this better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So the birds are not actually preferring one habitat to breed in and another habitat to winter at. These are resident birds. They stay on the same territory throughout the year. They stay on the same territory in summer and in winter. So it's not as if in summer that all these birds are going to breed in log forest, and then in winter all these birds are moving to another habitat into primary forest. It's just that in log forest, the birds that are breeding have higher or number of offspring. So they have a higher number of offspring being produced in log forest, whereas in primary forest, the number of offspring of birds that have territories on primary forest is lower than in log forest.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mousumi, there's one more question for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is bird population concepts. Like, so the person is asking, out of all the density dependent factors, one of them is stress. So can you give an example of that?
All right. Actually, sorry, I meant environmental stress, and in that slide, if you notice, I had listed quite a few density-dependent factors, including disease, competition for resources, predation. So all of them, like the factors such as competition for resources, predation, etc., which can influence birth rates and death rates. Especially when they negatively impact the population growth, they are referred to as stress. So ideally in that slide, I should have just put it in parentheses. Sorry for the confusion. Yeah.
Okay, so right now we are out of questions. No, there's one more in the chat box. Shall I read it for you? I'm not sure who it is, Nish and for Raj. So yeah, I'll just read it out for you.
I think it's for Umesh.
Yeah. So how is exploitation competition different from interference competition? And if in interference competition, the niche for foraging is increasing, wouldn't that also increase the survival in experimental part? where one species is removed, as we see in the exploitation competition. Umesh is still there?
So yes, thanks, Jobin. So in exploitation competition, two species are competing for the same resource, but there's no direct interaction between the two species. So let's say I put out, a tray of fruits in my balcony, and in the morning pigeons come and eat the fruit, and at night bats come and eat the fruit. So the pigeons and the bats never meet. But if the pigeons come and eat all the fruit, then the bats have nothing for them. So the presence of the pigeon is the reducing fitness of bats. So that's an instance of exploitation competition, where there are two species sharing the same resources, but there are no direct interactions between those two species. In interference competition, there is actually usually aggression. So if I am species A and there's another species B, and both of us feed on the same resource, in interference competition, I will interfere. I will actually prevent species B from access to those resources. So I will actively interfere to prevent the other species from accessing the resource. So that's the difference between interference and exploitation competition. KR TV has a question about studying immigration and emigration. It is not easy, you're right, but we will have a session on studying bird populations and techniques to study bird populations later on. And I'm sure some of your questions there will be answered. Anirudh has a question saying, how much greater are the rates of predation on species in a mixed hunting flock in the sentinel's absence? I'm sorry about this sound. I really, 1 minute. Okay. How much greater are the rates of predation on species in a mixed hunting flock in the sentinel's absence? I am not sure that anybody has quantified that, but basically what happens is, like you saw with the Martinez paper, Martinez study, where if you remove the sentinel from the flock actually changes its behavior. So if the sentinel is present, the flock feels, and using feels in a very loose way, but the flock forages in areas where they would not ordinarily forage. Which are areas with high visibility for predators, for example. And the absence of the sentinel, the flock forages in areas that are more dense, where visibility for predators is lower. Whether anybody has quantified differences in predation rates, I am not sure, but I think there will be a session on mixed flocks where some of those questions might be answered. A follow-up question from Govind, which is, why do bird populations become greater in log forests than primary forests? Wouldn't it be the other way around? You're absolutely right. And this was, when we did the study, I myself was scratching my head and I was thinking, what I expected was that the primary forest would be ideal habitat for these species. In log forests, these species would do badly. As in survival rates would be lower, reproductive rates would be lower, and so on. It's slightly a complicated answer. One potential answer is that there are certain species that actually do well in secondary forest that is in what's called succession. So some species do better in those kinds of habitats, whereas other species don't do too well in those habitats. So if you look at all the species, we were able to study only these 6 small, very, very common species, and they showed these trends. But if you look at other species that are larger, other species that require certain what are called microhabitats within primary forests, their survival rates, their reproduction rates actually fall quite drastically in log forest. The other reason is that there's climate change that's happening in these areas, and it's quite possible that as temperatures change, these relationships might actually overturn. They might actually become very different from what we saw for that particular study period. So the answer is potentially quite complicated, but you're right. It was quite a surprise for us to see patterns like this. But the short answer is that across species, traits are different. Some species are larger, some species are smaller, some species require certain habitats. Other species are generalists. They can survive in a large variety of habitats. And so the generalists tend to do better when forests are disturbed, and the specialists tend to lose out in those cases. Manjari has a question, which is when an assemblage or a guild is defined by a researcher, is this standardized and then recognized by other researchers? So if I were to say, here is the assemblage of rainforest bird species, I would think by and large, most researchers would agree, because these are species that are sort of found only in rainforests. They require warm, wet conditions. They're not found in any other kind of habitat. So I think if you define an assemblage as, let's say, a desert assemblage or a rainforest assemblage or dry deciduous forest bird assemblage, overall, I'm very sure most researchers would agree that this set of species makes up this kind of assemblage. The guilds might be slightly more loosely defined across. So if I was to say this is a species that is an insectivorous bird, so that's a dietary guild. So if you look at diet guilds, you have insectivorous birds feeding on arthropods, frugivorous birds feeding on fruit, omnivorous birds that feed on a variety of things, carnivorous birds that feed only on other vertebrates. Is Suhail saying something? So, for example, if I said all eagles are carnivorous birds, I don't think anybody would have a problem with that. But if I said that species is insectivorous and it ate a little bit of fruit, then somebody else might say it's actually not insectivorous, it's omnivorous. So there are these not disagreements, but small differences in the way in which birds are classified into guilds, like dietary guilds, or for example, if you said low elevation species, mid elevation species, high elevation species, those are elevation guilds. I might say low elevation goes from 0 meters to 900 meters. Somebody else might classify it as 0 meters to 1,100 meters. So there are these small differences, but by and large, I don't think there would be any disagreement in what a particular assemblage or what a particular guild is. Deepak Gujar, I think this is a question on keystone predation and trophic cascades, which is that there is a discussion about reintroducing leopards in India. Do you think this might lead to a top-down controlled trophic cascade effect on birds over time, which is the inverse to the Barrow Colorado Islands? So in that case, in the Barrow Colorado Island case, it was the removal of the jaguar that led to the extinction of ground nesting birds. This is a very difficult question to answer. Would there be a reverse trophic cascade? Right? So if you reintroduce leopards, would there be ground nesting birds actually coming back because the mesopredators are kept under control, like things like jackals or other small cats maybe? Honestly, I don't know. I can tentatively give you an answer, which is that the levels of specialization of birds in the Amazon, in the neotropics, is very, very high. So these ground nesting birds are extremely specialized and very, very vulnerable. In fact, there's a lot of literature that has come out very, very recently showing that ground foraging and ground nesting insectivorous birds are the most vulnerable guild to extinction when it comes to habitat fragmentation, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to all of these things. I am not sure that the degree of specialization of birds is that stark in India or in the old world tropics. For example, in areas that had leopards previously and now don't have leopards because they've been hunted out or for other reasons, we've not seen any birds going locally extinct, I think. Generally, those birds have managed to persist. So my my answer is I don't know, but I can come up with hypotheses that could be tested in the future. KR TV, that's for you, Mousumi.
Yeah, so regarding discrete and continuous population growth rates, I don't. One is not more accurate than the other, but of course it's tougher to measure continuous growth rate because you have to take many and more frequent measurements of the population to arrive at that. Regarding what is better, it would depend on the species that or organism that you're studying. For instance, say for example, if you're studying bacterial growth rate, which grows really fast, you will be measuring it much more frequently, and it might make more sense to compute or estimate continuous growth rate. But say for example, if you're studying birds or say tigers, they have specific breeding seasons, and so you might be taking measurements at discrete time points, incorporating information about when they breed. So in case of most natural populations of large organisms, this is what we measure, the discrete population growth rate, lambda. Yeah.
Naresh has a question. So what I think the problem is when I plug this in, it goes into this microphone, which is not very good. And when I remove it, I can't hear anything. My speakers aren't working. So I'm just plugging and removing as and when I need to hear and speak. So sentinel species and habitat use. So in a mixed species block, and again, like Devika was saying in the chat box, there is going to be a separate session on mixed species bird blocks after this in the coming week. A sentinel species is mixed species bird flocks are groups of species that associate with each other. They feed together, they move together. They're very tightly knit networks of interacting species that form a very cohesive unit. In these mixed blocks, the sentinel species, the role of the sentinel species is to provide cohesion in these blocks by doing one very important thing. The sentinel species is usually a fly-catching species. It's usually a species that feeds on arthropods, insects that are in flight. And because the sentinel species is feeding on things that are in flight, it has to keep constantly scanning its environment to look in the air for insects that are flying. What that does is makes the sentinel species also very good at detecting predators. So sentinel species are amongst the first to give alarm calls against predators of other birds in the flock. So the presence of the sentinel species means that a lot of the time that is spent looking out for predators by other species in the flock is no longer required. So if I am a species and I have a sentinel species with me looking out for predators, I can concentrate more on searching for food. So that's the role of the sentinel species here, is to reduce the burden of time spent looking for predators and allowing the other species in the flock to forage more efficiently. So when you remove the sentinel species, what's happening is now that these birds need to spend a lot more time, either they need to spend a lot more time looking out for predators, which means they have less time available for feeding, or they need to move to habitats that are dense enough to make it difficult for predators to find them. So that is what the sentinel species and habitat use is, where the sentinel species allows the other species in the flock to use those habitats that they ordinarily wouldn't have used, because in the absence of the sentinel species, they would be much denser habitat because they need to escape from predation in the sentinel species, not providing them with an early warning system. Okay, so this was the reintroduction of the cheetah, not the leopard. Again, semi-arid habitats, that open grasslands, that the cheetah is is native to. Again, I don't know. But it's true that there are a lot of ground nesting birds in these open grasslands, and it's certainly a possibility, and I think it would make a great study. Once the cheetah comes in and is reintroduced to the habitat, to look at patterns of activity of these other mesopredators like jackals and so on, whether those change, and if those change, what happens. You can put up camera traps near nests and see whether the rates at which nests are destroyed by these mesopredators actually changes or not, and what that means for the re-emergence of populations of these ground nesting birds. But as of now, we don't know. Could it be possible that the presence of birds in primary forests is less visible than in log forests? Sampling would be difficult in dense areas. Great question. Actually, we deal with that by estimating something called detection probability. So, if I went into a primary forest and I went into a log forest, obviously the vegetation structure is very different. The probability that I see a particular bird can be very different in primary forest and very different in log forest. So let's say I go into primary forest and I see 20% of the birds, and I go into log forest and I see 50% of the birds. And I come back and the actual number of birds that I've seen is 10 in primary forest and 10 in log forest. The number of birds in primary forest is actually far higher because I've seen only 20% of the birds in primary. But there will be a separate session on estimating populations while accounting for this variable called detection probability. So when we do these studies, we're not just comparing raw numbers, we're actually using techniques that allow us to estimate the proportion of birds that we've missed, and therefore giving us much better estimates of things like population size and things like survival. Govind asks which type of assemblage based on habitat of birds are most threat of extinction in India. I think in terms of immediate threat to extinction, it would be grassland birds. Both the alluvial grasslands, which the terai and the duars, which are on the foothills of the Himalayas, birds. Those basically that's very good for agriculture, right? So large parts of those wet grassland habitats have been replaced by agriculture, especially rice. And the populations of species like Bengal florican, populations like black-breasted parrotbill, swamp pinia, marsh babbler have plummeted. They're all very tiny fragmented populations of species. So at immediate risk would be alluvial grasslands as well as the arid grasslands in India's northwest, which are being threatened again by agriculture, by also the stopping of systems like agropastoral. It's a long. I don't think we have time to cover all of that now. But there are other assemblages in India that are at risk. For example, our species in the Western Ghats and our species in the Himalayas are very, very temperature sensitive. They are adapted to a very narrow range of temperatures. And what happens, especially the Eastern Himalayas and the Western Ghats, is with climate change happening, birds are being forced to move upwards in mountains just to remain in the same climatic area that they're used to. So their temperature niche. And what's happened in other parts of the world, like the Andes, is that these birds move up, reach the tops of these mountains, and there's nowhere left to go. And so they go locally extinct. And so immediate threats from land use change and the loss of habitat, definitely it would be grassland birds. From longer term threats that we might not be able to control, like climate change and just warming happening and these birds moving up and running out of habitat, definitely even the birds in our mountains are in our threat. But there will be a session on bird conservation later on. The exams, Devika has answered that question. How do birds in a mixed species choose a sentinel among them? This is a co-evolved relationship. They're actually not waking up in the morning and saying, which one do I go with? Give me a moment, please. It's a relationship between species that has evolved over time. And as you know, evolution will select for those particular relationships that are mutually beneficial to each other. So, for example, millions of years ago, if bird A associated with bird B and was not getting too much benefit out of that. And bird A associated with bird C, and there were some benefits there. Then the association between A and C will be selected, and so this could be something hardwired, you know. So if I am a brown-cheeked vulveta, I will associate with a greater rackettail drongo. So you know, I wake up in the morning and I listen to the call of the greater rackettail drongo, and I associate. If I bring in another sentinel, let's say I go to the Eastern Himalayas, catch a sentinel, bring it to the Western Ghats, I doubt that the brown-cheeked vulveta is going to say, all right, now I have another one here. Shall I associate with this? It's probably hardwired in the brain of the brown-cheeked vulveta dealer. All right, I'm going to listen for the call of the greater rackettail drongo and associate with it in these crops. Amit asked a question: is there massive decline in a particular species, for example, Nicobar metaphor, declining without any known facts? How much should the study frequency and how can it be conserved? Again, I think this is a question better suited to the conservation section of the of this course, where we will look at different forms of rarity, and we will be looking at case studies that focus on certain bird species and how people have studied them and how people have taken measures to ensure that they remain, you know, their populations remain viable. So, Amrit, if you could just wait for a few weeks, I think your question will be answered. Rishika has a question. There are a few papers by NCF scientists like Dr. Shankaraman on bird species diversity and abundance in rainforests. Study rainforest specialists, decrease in logging or ongoing restoration projects, where generalists have found an abundance in open areas, thereby increasing the number of species diversity. My observations. Rishika, you're absolutely right. Our metric of success or conservation success cannot be maximizing species richness. So if I look at two habitats and I say species, habitat A has 20 species, habitat B has 10 species, does not mean that habitat A is more worthy of conservation. When I say more worthy, I mean from the point of view that conservation always has limited amount of funds and other resources to play with. So you have to put your efforts in one of these two places. Of course, a very hypothetical scenario. But if these 20 species were widely spread across the globe and they had large population sizes and so on, and these 10 species were rainforest specialists that were extremely rare, located in only a few parts of the world, then obviously it would be these 10 species and the area in which they're found that is worth saving. And this is related to the concepts of environmental and demographic stochasticity, which again we will come in, get into when we talk about bird conservation. So yeah, I agree with you, Ruchika. Okay. Amrit has another question about how the population of migrants in any particular time and location will affect the residents feeding on the same food. So there have been studies in South America where they have looked at, so you have residents, right? They're there all year long. And suddenly for 6 months of the year, you've got another set of species suddenly landing up over there. Often, the movement of these species is tied to the amount of resources available. So, in these areas where there are residents, the migrants will also come in at a time when there's a boom in the amount of food. And so, it seems like there's not much competition. And when the amount of resources comes down here, the amount of resources are going up somewhere else, and the migrants just move to the other part of their range to take advantage of that. Govind has a question about the Malabar Bay hornbill being threatened. What issues are they facing specifically compared to others in the Western Ghats? Again, we will be having a quite detailed session on conservation, but it's a large bird. Large birds tend to be much more threatened and much more vulnerable to any kind of what we call global change. Habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, so on and so forth. So, off the top of my head, the main causes for the threats to Western Ghats birds are habitat loss, obviously, climate change that might cause them to move up these habitats that they can't colonize. The upper elevations of the Western Ghats are basically shola grassland habitats, and so forest birds coming into those habitats are not going to live in grassland, so they'll run out of habitat. And of course, the fact that at the high elevation, the shola grasslands are being replaced by exotic tree species and so on. Is there anything particular about the Malappuram area? Off the top of my head, I can only think of larger body size being a trait that causes species to be vulnerable to extinction. But that would be also true of species like the great hornbill or the white-bellied creeper and other species like that. But we can discuss all this when we talk about conservation.
I think there's a raised hand. Should we take questions from without the chat box?
Aren't we doing questions that are only in the chat box?
I think so. But Noor, if you want to ask a question, I think it's better to write it in the chat box.
Noor Islam, could you type your question with the chat box, please? KFTV has a question on amensalism. So if you look at two species interactions, you can classify them in many ways. Like two species, both of which have a positive interaction in each other, that's a mutualism or a symbiosis. If two species both have negative impacts on each other, that's competition. Amensalism is a case where one species has a negative impact on another species, but this species that's having a negative impact on the other species neither benefits nor loses from the interaction. So let's say I'm an elephant and I'm walking through the forest, and there's this ground nesting bird, and I step on the nest. I step on the bird's lost. The bird's lost reproductive success. It's lost out offspring. For me, as an elephant, it makes absolutely no difference, right? I've not gained anything from that interaction. I've not lost anything from that interaction. So that's what that's an example of amensalism. Amur falcon migration, last year seen almost everywhere in Maharashtra, earlier it was seen only in limited area. I don't know about this, Mousumi.
I guess I think it's just because people are looking out for the species more. It's out. The information is available all over media. I think that's why it's just I feel that detections have increased, possibly.
Yeah, I guess there's just been so much more interest in bird watching and Amur falcon in particular. So I guess what we say is that people are actually looking for it, whereas earlier they were. Nakondam Island is populated approximately 1,800 resident endemic. Nakondam hornbills. How would a big flock of competitive species will affect those endemic residents? I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you mean that you suddenly have a number of other species coming onto Nakondam? Is there any reason to expect that? The Nakondam is quite far off, right? And it's not easy to get to. And there are a large number of frugivorous bird species on Nakondam already, birds like the hill myna and the imperial pigeons. But they're all coexisting with the Nakondam hornbill. Now, if you brought in another 2,000 birds that fed at the same rate as the Nakondam hornbill, they probably could be as complete, and then populations, in theory would predict that populations of the Narcondam hornbill should come down. In fact, there is this theory of competitive exclusion as well, which is very, very influential in community ecology, which says that no two species that share the same niche can coexist because one will drive the other to extinction. One will basically outcompete the other. So if, according to the theory of competitive exclusion, if you brought in, 3,000 some other hornbill that was a superior competitor to the Narcondam hornbill, then it would over time drive the Narcondam hornbill to extinction. But I don't see why that would happen. It would require us doing something to